everyone, and welcome to another edition of Developing the National Human Capital Policy on Amogate Radio Communications this beautiful Tuesday, October 29, 2024. How have you been? It's so great to be here with you. Thank you so much for joining us last week. We hope you had a great time. We hope you had an illuminating time, right? An enlightening time, an expository session, right? It's our joy, it's our delight to be doing this with you again. And today we are going to delve deeper into the topic, into the theme we're exploring. But just before we do, let me remind you that my name is Tolo Modara. This is Amoge Radio Communications. We are looking at the topic of developing a national human capital policy, and it's great to be with you. Thank you very much. Now, last week we tried to look at elements of a national human capital policy. We also tried to explore the reason for developing a national human capital policy. Why do we need to develop a national human capital policy? Why is it critical to develop a national human capital policy? Let me quickly try to capture some of the highlights of last week as a refresher for those of us who joined, and also to lay the foundation for those who probably didn't join. Like I said, it was important to ask ourselves, why exactly do we need a national human capital policy? And one of the reasons we said this is because you cannot be strategic in your approach to synchronizing several other policies, right? And that's why one of the things we said is that a national human capital policy is an integration of several other policies. I repeat, a national human capital policy is an integration of several other policies, the foundation of which, of course, should be health policy, because if people aren't alive and well, you can build on anything, right? Then, very importantly, is your education policy. We emphasize that you do not educate in a vacuum. And this is why you need a national human capital policy. If you don't know what you're educating for, how then do you educate your people, right? What are you educating them for? By this, we mean what kind of strategic goals do you have as a nation? What policy goals? What areas do you want to develop competitive strengths in as a nation? What sectors do you want to have competitive advantage in as a nation? If you have not defined these things, then you may be educated in a vacuum. That a national human capital policy is required to help you synthesize these other critical policies, your health policy, your education policy, right? How do you educate your people? What do you educate for? What do you incentivize them towards? You must have certain incentives that you lay in order to garner your people, to channel your people, their strengths, their capabilities, their skills, their talents towards certain areas that you must have predefined as a nation, in terms of your economic advantage, or your it could even be your outsourcing goals and so on and so forth. But you must have defined these things ahead proactively, and then you begin to work it back. And that's why you need a national human capital policy to help you synchronize these other policies, right? How do you synchronize, for instance, the town and the gown? We talked about your synchronization policy. That's another very important thing, right? The education experts should be working in line with the industry giants to ensure that they are equipping people to be more ready, if I can put it that way, more prepared to hit the ground running once they are recruited by the town. This is, however, not going to happen in the absence of an effective and efficient, strategic, and proactive national human capital policy, right? They also talk about workforce development and so to say, the deployment, very, very important. It's not just about workforce development, but also workforce deployment. This is why in the national human capital policy, where do you want to deploy the workforce towards after you have develop them, right? Then, of course, the talent management strategy. We didn't go deep into that, but we spoke a little bit more about the national STEM workforce strategy. We emphasized the need to ensure that our young people are being more or less compelled to go into sciences, to make it as attractive as possible in the 21st century world of artificial intelligence and machine learning and predictive analytics. This, as far as we are concerned, is a sine qua non, a critical requirement for any nation to be competitive, right? And that is part of why you need a national human capital policy to define how you want to incentivize them towards these things, how you want to make these fields attractive to them, right? There must be a strategic development of a national human capital policy as a solution again to structural unemployment. Structural unemployment, like my colleague Dr. Tito Lagunshono emphasized significantly last quarter, is when the jobs in an economy do not match the skills in an economy. So if, for instance, you're interested in offshore wind energy as a nation, but you are not intentionally raising capacity, building capacity in that area, ultimately you would be importing skills from abroad. And so there could be unemployment in your nation, but there are jobs. It's just that the jobs do not match the skills. So in the absence of a national human capital policy, there could be structural unemployment. However, if you have predefined the areas you want to grow, the areas you want to compete, the areas you want to engage, the areas you want to expand, and so on and so forth, as policy goals, the national human capital policy should then be developed to ascertain the synchronization of these different policy areas, policy needs, policy objectives, and policy strategies. Well, I'll mention a few more things we discussed last week, and then we'll go into the subject for today. We emphasize the fact that versatility does not just happen. And today we are going to talk a little bit about the nation of India, right? I won't go into it yet, but just take note that versatility doesn't just happen. Whatever you see in any nation, whatever you see as a competitive advantage of any nation, as a human capital advantage of any nation, for the most part, did not just happen. It was not accidental. They didn't stumble upon it. These things were often predetermined, pre-planned, hence the need for a national human capital policy, right? One of the things we need to know is that when we don't have a national human capital policy, we miss the opportunity to build things at the foundation, right? When you have a national human capital policy, you can begin with the end in mind, like we said last week. You have that strategic end in mind, and you begin to lay the foundation and progress methodically, intentionally, deliberately, consistently towards it. Hence, the need for that national human capital policy that must be laid at the foundation, right? I'm going to add one thing very quickly. I was reading during the week one of the most famous, I think he is currently not just one of the most famous, but he's actually currently said to be the most famous professor at the Wharton School of Business, at the Wharton School in University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the top universities in the world, not just one of the top universities in America. And he, that is Adam Grant. He was talking about ability versus agility. He said the 21st century need is not going to be so. By need, there he's talking about talent need, the skill need. He was saying that the 21st century need is not going to be so much of ability, but agility. Not so much of ability, but agility. Now, if you follow us in Amogate, you will know that we are very passionate about ambidexterity. Right? Versatility. These are things that are very, very important to us. Your ability to move across fields. We believe a lot in being multi-skilled. And this is the same point I was making last week when I said it's extremely important for us to ensure that our young people, based on our national human capital policy, which will then lead to our education policy, to ensure that our young people can crisscross different fields. They must be compelled to go into different fields at the foundation. So if Adam Grant is saying that, it's going to be agility over ability, my question is that agility suddenly going to happen? No, it's not. If you have not built that at the foundation of your national human capital policy, infused it into your education policy, infused it into your talent management strategy, infused it into your workforce development strategy, how then are you going to be able to compete with agility as a nation in the days to come, or in the days we're already in, if I may say, when agility is already the order of the day, is being demanded, is being rewarded, extremely important. It's no longer just being stuck in a particular field, but being able to piece everything together. I was reading again during the week that, in these days of knowledge explosion, nobody really rewards knowledge acquisition unlike before. What they now reward is knowledge integration. Back in the days of pre-Google and pre-internet, knowledge acquisition was largely applauded. But now people are looking for your ability to recognize the patterns, to draw the trends, to piece the puzzles. That is about versatility, is about agility. Again, my point is that these are not going to just emerge. These are things that are not suddenly going to happen. If you do not put them at the foundation of the National Human Capital Policy, if you not deliberately articulate them as end goals, that we want talent that are versatile, talent that are agile, talent that are ambidextrous, talent that are able to crisscross different fields and integrate the pieces of knowledge and identify the patterns, which is what machine learning is all about, by the way. Foundationally, machine learning is about pattern recognition. If we don't identify, articulate these as the foundation or as critical elements of our national human capital policy and educate deliberately towards this, ensure that workforce development and deployment is also done intentionally towards this direction or towards these objectives, it will not just happen. Agility over ability, like Adam Grant was saying, is not going to happen all of a sudden. These are things that must be deliberately, intentionally, strategically, and proactively planned. Hence the need for a national human capital policy. My name is Solomon. This is Amogere Communications, and this program is developing a national human capital policy. It's such a joy, it's such a delight, it's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry if I'm sounding extremely passionate about this. This is what I strongly believe in. I think is extremely important. I think that ultimately the greatest treasures are not hidden in the minds and are not there and trust me, I come from a nation that is blessed with huge national resources. That's Nigeria. I'm proudly Nigerian. But I will still tell you that ultimately the greatest treasures are not in the mines, they're not in the woods, they're not in the oil pipes. Ultimately, they are in the hearts and the minds of the people. That's the greatest treasure. So we must understand how to unlock the treasures therein. Just think about it. Mark Zuckerberg today is said to be one of the richest men in the world. That simply is a talent. He had to be identified and supported. You may say, oh, but he dropped out of school. What about his elementary school or his primary school? What about his high school? What about his previous days in the college? How was he educated? What kind of environment was created around him? What kind of enabling environment that supported expression of ideas, creativity was created around him, was developed around him, was nurtured, was supported, was enabled, that ended up, birthing a Mark Zuckerberg, the ditto for Steve Jobs, and so on and so forth. Go and check each of those people that are so-called billionaires or even trillionaires today. There was a certain pattern to their development. And I dare say, even my humble self, I know I was raised deliberately in an environment where knowledge was celebrated, intelligence was applauded, creativity, even your ability to question the norms, right from home to the school I was raised in, nursery, primary, secondary, or elementary, high school, like you say, all of that encouraged, deliberately stimulated, rewarded expression of creativity. I'm telling you, these things do not just happen. Now, at a national level, we need to deliberately articulate policies that will ensure that by the time our talent, our people, our human capital is getting to the level where they should be exported. When I say exported, I'm not talking about brain drain. I don't believe in that. I'm not talking about excessive. I believe in brain circulation, but I don't believe in excessive brain drain. I'm talking about when they are either being channeled towards policy goals or towards competitive areas of the economy that we have predefined and so on and so forth. By the time we are ready for that as a nation or as nations or as a region, we would have laid a proper foundation because we had a clearly defined end in mind. Extremely important. Now, I know we're running out of time, but thank God we have more weeks to come. Let me quickly, again, I'm still sort of capturing last week, but then going into this week, especially on this issue of agility over ability, right? The issue of agility over ability is something that I like I said, I read in this past week, and I felt the need to use it to further buttress the point that certain things must be laid on the foundation. That was a point that was made last week. Last week, we said one of the things we miss when we don't have a national human capital policy is that we miss the opportunity to build things at the foundation. And this is the point I was connecting to what Adam Grant said, that it's going to be agility over ability. And I said, well, that agility is not going to suddenly happen. If you have not laid the foundation for agility, it's not going to come out of nowhere, right? Last week, we said there's an element of learning by doing that needs to be consolidated in the classroom. Sometimes it's too late by the time they get to the boardroom. In fact, that's too high. It's too late by the time they get to the office. It's too late by the time they get to industry. it's too late by the time they step out from down into the town if we have not laid the foundation of learning by doing. And this is part of why sometimes we have very poor execution excellence across the sectors. Trust me. At Namogate, we've worked multi-sectorally from private to public to non-profit sectors. And sometimes the level of execution effectiveness can be extremely low. Again, these are things that we need to begin to address with the National Human Capital Policy, an effective National Human Capital Policy that synchronizes from education to talent development to STEM strategy and so on and so forth. STEM, of course, means science, technology, economics, engineering, and mathematics, right? Maybe it's time to add a second E for sake of versatility and let it become STEM with a double E with economics. Oh my God. Thank you for being with us. I hope you're having as much fun as I am, right? Very, very, very important, right? We emphasize the need for developing a national STEM workforce strategy and said it must be an integral part of a national human capital policy in today's world of predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and full stack coding, right? We must have a sufficient and robust human capital base. Let me explain what I mean. Because we need to make sure we have more than enough to draw from. Very, very, very important, right? And that's why we keep talking about the need for that. We can't have less than enough. We must have more than enough. We must have an abundance of talent to draw from. And that's why it's very important to begin to look at our national workforce strategy, especially from the STEM perspective, and begin to integrate these into education. Finally, we said postgraduate education is extremely important because the higher rate of researchers for every 1,000 workers has been associated with highly developed countries, right? So the highly developed countries have been said to have the highest rate of researchers for every 1,000 workers that they have. They have the highest rate of researchers. And I said, why is it then a surprise that they have ended up becoming highly developed countries? Of course not. Again, these things do not just happen. They must very, very intentionally, proactively, strategically plan. If a nation sets out to have a high rate of researchers per 1,000 workers and they begin to channel different policies towards it, including immigration policies, right? Like you find in the United States, why should we then be surprised that such nations like the United States and Japan end up being highly developed countries? These things, like I will keep emphasizing on this program, are strategically and proactively planned. Hence the need for a national human capital policy. Now let's begin to go on into one of the things I will talk about today, right? One of the things I want to carry on from this issue of postgraduate education, and please just bear with me. Like I said, a lot of the things we are doing is about the evidence, right? What do we need to do? What does the evidence suggest that is required? It's not about what we feel like doing, right? Once we remember, begin with the end in mind, Stephen Covey's second principle in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Once we determine where we are going, we then have to walk it back and say, what do we need to do to get here? Once we have articulated that policy goal, once we have articulated that end, it's then not left to our whims and caprices or our pleasures and preferences. It's now about what we must do, what we are compelled to do to achieve that end, right? It's not so much about what we feel like doing, but what we need to do, the requirements, let me use that word, the requirements for that strategic end to be attained. That's why I have to talk about postgraduate education. Some people are not comfortable, so why postgraduate education? Why are you biased? I asked myself, are some people going to accuse me of being biased? I even asked myself during the course of the week, why are you going to continue on this theme of postgraduate education that you ended? Is there no other thing? But that's what the research showed, right? That's what the evidence seems to indicate, right? After reading the number of articles and diving into and researching and preparing for this week, I saw that a number of the articles emphasize the need for postgraduate education. And therefore, again, it's not about what I feel like talking about. Remember, it's about what the evidence seems to indicate. So the rest of today, My apologies for those who may not feel comfortable with this or those who may think, oh, are we not about fantastic education? Well, like I said, we are beginning with the end in mind, and if we work it out from the end, if the end suggests that we need to emphasize education or postgraduate education, then let's call it what it is, right? Let's say it as it should be said, because this is what the data is indicating. I'm going to draw two examples from two nations for the sake of time, and then we will continue there from there. So one of the papers I delved into, right, in the course of study, gave the example of Portugal, right? Portugal is a nation in Eastern Europe, and after noticing that they were, more or less going down in so many ways, they decided to have a specific goal to increase the number of those who had doctorate degrees, right? Very, very deliberately. And they had to do this over a 40-year period. Can you imagine? If remember what I've been saying, is about the end in mind. It's about being visionary. It's a very long-term goal. It's a policy goal. It's not going to happen overnight. They actually set that goal and they began the investment. Portugal, by the way, is in southwestern Europe, right? Is a country in southwestern Europe, and they began to analyze the flows of their doctorate over the period, and they began to plan very intentionally from about 1970 to 2010. That's a 40-year period. I repeat, 1970 to 2010, right? This study was carried out, I think, sometime between 2010 and 2020. And they began to say, okay, let's begin to, make a deliberate, a thorough reform of the Portuguese tertiary education system. Very, very intentional, right? And after they completed this thorough reform and invested significantly in public investment, they invested significantly in this is not private investment now, this is public sector investment, in other words, government, in science and technology. They noticed, they measured, and they saw that there had been an increase in the number of those with doctorate degrees. And they measured these degrees based on, one, those who obtained the degrees in Portugal, two, those who were of Portuguese origin and obtained the degrees outside of Portugal, but sought to be accredited or to be certified when they got back to Portugal or when they reconnected with Portugal. And three, they also measured those who got the degrees outside of Portugal but did not bother getting certified in Portugal. But what was important was that these people were of Portuguese descent. So they measured it over that period and they saw an increase. Now, what was interesting to me was that finally, as they saw the increase in those with these doctorate degrees, particularly in science and technology, they then also noticed the reversal in the backward trend they had in their region in terms of science and technological growth. There's no other way about it. Like I said, I reflected before this workshop and I said, are some people going to say, why are you overemphasizing education? Why are you overemphasizing postgraduate education? Like I said, I did not necessarily set out to emphasize postgraduate education, but that is simply what the research is saying. That if we want to advance, I first saw it in the research for last week's episode. I've seen it again as I delved into research for this week's episode. The trend is consistent. If we truly want to progress in science and technology, which is going to give us a critical edge in today's world, that is driven significantly by technological trends. You all know, from payments platforms to business development to marketing to almost everything is dictated by technology these days. We've gone from mere artificial intelligence now to generative AI, and it keeps going on and on. If a nation is going to be competitive, the data is saying, as with the case study of Portugal, if the nation is going to gain a competitive edge technology-wise, there is no other way but to invest significantly in postgraduate education in sciences. This is simply what the data is saying. This is simply what the evidence is indicating. We have to do this, right? Because one of the things we set out to do on this program is to also talk about what, should be the elements of our national helicopter policy as a nation, and then what do we need to do? We've talked about why the need for a national helicopter policy. We've talked about what should be some of the elements of the national helicopter policy. We did that last week. You can always revisit the episode on our MixLR page or on our YouTube page, right? We also talked about developing a national STEM workforce strategy. We've not talked about the how, but we talked about the why, right? We talked about that, and we're still referring to that. We're still referencing that this week, right? But we are now beginning to say, how do we develop this national human capital policy? We've talked about why, but how do we do it? What should be the national human capital policy, right? And what does the evidence suggest? The how should we do it is not so much about whims and caprices, but what does the evidence suggest? The evidence is clearly indicating from the one we saw last week that for every 1,000 workers, the nations that are highly developed have the highest rate of researchers per every 1,000 workers, and it is a very deliberate policy. It's a very, very intentional goal. It's not something that just happens. Now, for this week's research, again, we are saying that nations that want to have an advantage in science and technology deliberately set out to increase the number of those with doctorate degrees in science and technology. There is no other way. From what we are seeing, from what the data is indicating, from what the evidence is indicating, we are going to have to invest more intentionally. When I say we, nations that are interested in developing a national human capital policy that will give them a competitive edge are going to have to invest deliberately, intentionally in postgraduate education, right? Particularly the doctorate level education. One of the things that interested me in this research, let me quickly reference it. I like the fact that when they were, looking at the data and trying to see whether there was a correlation between the increase in their investments in doctorate education and the increase in their competitiveness in science and technology as a nation. Part of how they gathered the data, they looked at the official annual R&D, that's research and development survey of all entities that carry out research and development, that's governmental, higher education, profit, non-for-profit, and companies. They looked at the official annual R&D survey of all of these entities, including information on all their individual researchers. That's a lot, every single individual researcher. They also looked at the National Register of Ongoing Doctoral Theses, which is an annual survey of all higher education institutions that collects data on ongoing and completed doctoral theses with information on the researcher, the institutions, the field of science, the supervisor, and the abstract. That's a lot of data. Of course, very necessary. In today's world, you know the meaning of data. Everything artificial intelligence, machine learning is based on data, is raw data, and then the machine begins to learn by identifying the patterns, but you need the data. But it was just interesting to me that they had this data. I asked myself, how many nations have such data? I can imagine that the more highly developed nations have this data, but unfortunately, the lower developed nations may not necessarily have data. A country like Nigeria, for instance, I asked myself, do we have a national register of all ongoing doctoral theses, which includes the thesis, the information of the researcher, the institutions, the field of science, the field of study, supervisor, and as well as the abstract? This is very, very important. So they looked at the annual information on this data of all PhDs whose degrees were gained or recognized by Portuguese universities since 1970. Remember, like I said, they were tracking 1970 to 2010, a period of 40 years. They looked at the surveys of careers of doctorate holders, so those who actually finished their doctorate degree, they now began to look at their careers. I can imagine that's where they began to track the correlation. They looked at the survey of careers of doctorate holders, which is a statistical operation that collects information on the categorization of PhDs, their academic training, professional situation, international mobility, and scientific production. They also looked at the biographical records of teachers in higher education, which collects annual information on the composition of the academic staff of all higher education establishments. They looked at the employer-employee data set collected annually by the Ministry of Labor and social security with information on firms, establishments, and workforce, including information on individual employees, the education levels, the data on employees with PhDs, as well as, of course, the productivity that these PhD holders had brought across sectors. Again, remember, they're looking at this from non-for-profits to for-profits to public sector and so on and so forth, right? I'll give us two more data sources that I found interesting. They looked at administrative data from the Portuguese Science and Technology Foundation, which include biographical data on postdoctoral fellowships, those who want to do postdoc after their postdoctoral fellowships funded directly, postdoctoral fellowships and contracts of PhD researchers funded by scientific research projects, and also PhD researchers contracted by the associate laboratories and research units supported specifically in the period 2007-2009. Let me stop there. Again, my point is this. They dug into what these PhD holders as well as postdoctoral PhD holders had done with their research. They looked at the specific topics they had analyzed. They looked at the impact of that on the progress of science and technology in Portugal, and they were able to come to a conclusion that having deliberately invested in science and technology postgraduate education, they were finally able to catch up and reverse the trend, because before this trend, they saw that they were lagging behind. And after they made this investment, they saw that they were no longer lagging behind as they had been before this investment. I think, again, like I said last week, this is the case of Reps Ipsa Loquito, where the matter speaks for itself. If we are going to have a national human capital policy that wants to put us at a competitive edge, and I'm not saying everybody should have a PhD, no. As a matter of fact, the last I checked a few months ago, only 2% of people in the world actually, or only 2% of people who get an education go on to have a PhD. I'm not saying everybody should have a PhD, but I'm saying that if the data indicates that there is a correlation between the number of PhD holders in the nation, between the number of researchers in the nation, and whether or not the nation goes on to become a highly developed country, then we have to incentivize postgraduate education, postgraduate research in fields like science and technology. There is the data is saying it. That's all. Well, one more country, I'm not going to go deeply into this country, but I want to quickly mention it, is India. India is known as a huge exporter of talent, right? A huge exporter of talent. Silicon Valley is pupilled significantly, significantly by many Indians, right? In fact, as a matter of fact, the person leading Microsoft today is an Indian or a man of Indian descent. That's Satya Nadella, and I can go on and on. They are doing extremely well, but it would interest you to know that again, this did not just happen. It was a very intentional goal. It was very intentional policy direction that they were going to invest in strengthening their human capital for knowledge economy. Very important. They decided that they wanted to compete in the knowledge economy, and they developed a national human capital policy to that direction. We've spoken a lot about Portugal today. We are not going to delve into India today for the sake of time, but next week I'm going to talk a little bit more about how India got to where they are and why today they are exporting talent significantly. They also have their own talent at home too, and they're doing greatly, right? But today, India is, as a nation, from a diplomatic perspective, they are engaging well with almost every segment of the world, either BRICS or Western nations, and so on and so forth. They are doing so well. Again, this was not something that just happened. They had a clear policy goal decades ago, as in the case of Portugal. They set to achieve something, and they are on track, even though some of their researchers are identifying areas in which they should grow. Which is expected. You should always keep asking yourself, how can we improve? But at least where they are today is a function of extremely deliberate policy goals and implementation and policy implementation. Well, I think this is where we are going to draw a curtain on today's edition of the program. This edition of the program has carried on from where we stopped last week. And today's edition of the program, one of the things we have done is to emphasize the need for research, right? We started by talking about it last week, a national state workforce strategy. We talked about the need to incentivize it and compel it more or less at every level, and especially at the foundational level, right? The elementary school, the high school, compel science and make it as attractive as possible to young people. Today, we've gone beyond the elementary level and said, okay, for the 2% who go ahead to study this at the PhD level, make sure that your nation is getting the best out of it. Make sure your nation is supporting them. Make sure your nation is not suboptimal, right? If the data indicates that about 2% of people go on to get their PhDs, make sure your nation is not having 0.02 or 0.2%, or that most of the researchers that from your nation are actually being employed by other nations, right? We must move from brain drain and brain gain to brain circulation. Extremely important. Thank you very much again for joining us. I hope you've not found today too academic. Like I said, we are talking about policy goals. We are looking at what the evidence indicates. This is not about what we feel like discussing, but this is about what we need to discuss, what we need to address, what we need to focus on if we are going to have competitive national human capital policies that will enable us operate at the competitive edge of the global value chains. Next week, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about India, and we talk about more things. There's still a whole lot to be explored in this program. For now, remember, we cannot ignore the science and technology and innovation aspects of a national human capital policy. The reason why, one of the things that a national human capital policy should produce, one of the outcomes it should produce, is enhanced innovation in your nation that helps you to compete and that helps you to earn way more than you can earn from oil and gold. Will come from ideas, creativity, and exploitation of innovative solutions. Thank you very much for being with us. My name is Tolo Madera. This has been Amoge Communications, developing a national human capital policy. I hope we've learned some things. I hope we've gained some things. We will continue next week by God's grace. Until then, please think about these things either as a policymaker or as a policy influencer, or even as a citizen that has the right to demand the kind of policies and leadership that we want in order to get our nations to compete more effectively in the Committee of Nations. Thank you very much again. We'll be back same time, same station next week. Until then, please keep thinking national human capital, and let's move from the days where all we make money from in some nations is oil and gold, and let's begin to make money like other nations are doing from ideas, science, and innovation. Thank you so much again. Please follow us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. Look up our past videos on Mixer, on YouTube, and send us your feedback or contact at theamoge.org. We look forward to hearing from you. Until we see you same time, same station next week. Keep thinking innovation, keep thinking nations, and keep thinking national human capital. Thank you.